What is Hadith? I recently finished Javed Ghamdi's complete 4.5 hour series on the question, what is Hadith? And I expected to disagree with much of what he said, and in many ways I still do. I still think Ghamdi often departs from what many classical scholars regarded as the strongest textual reading, especially when his conclusions align closely with modern moral intuitions. But this discussion accomplished something I didn't expect. It forced me to question one assumption I had carried for years. Whenever I saw an authentic hadith, I mentally translated it into Muhammad definitely said this. Today, I'm no longer sure that is the right way to think about hadith. Gandhi's thesis is that the religion itself comes through two sources, the Qur'an and the established Sunnah transmitted by the Muslim community. Hadith, in his framework, are the historical record of Muhammad's life. Whether you agree with him or not, that distinction immediately changes the conversation. Instead of asking only whether a hadith is authentic, we began asking how historical reports should be evaluated and what level of certainty they actually provide. The most valuable part of the series was not any single argument. It was realizing how many layers existed between Muhammad and a modern Muslim trying to discover what Allah wants. Scholars had to decide which reports survived, which narrators were trustworthy, whether two narrators actually met, whether the wording had changed, whether one narration overrode another, whether a report established law, whether a report reflected a one-time event or a universal rule. That is an extraordinary amount of human judgment. One disagreement particularly stood out. Malik often treated the established practice of the early people of Medina as exceptionally strong evidence because that community lived closest to Muhammad, and many companions remained there. Al-Shafi'i shifted the center of gravity toward authenticated reports, even when local practice differed. Neither scholar denied hadith, they disagreed about the methodology. That surprised me because I had imagined there was one universally accepted approach to recovering Muhammad's teachings. Before this discussion, I rarely distinguished between corroborated reports and authentic single-chain reports. Now I think that distinction matters. That does not mean every single-chain narration is false. Honest people can preserve genuine history. But should one line of transmission be sufficient to establish binding law for every Muslim until the end of time? I honestly don't know anymore. I also realize that authenticity is not the same thing as certainty. A report can satisfy traditional criteria while still leaving historians asking how confident we should ultimately be. A Muslim could respond that all ancient history works this way. That is true. We reconstruct Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, and many other ancient figures through incomplete evidence. But religion claims something different from ordinary history. Muhammad is presented as God's final messenger, whose guidance is meant for all humanity until the end of time. If that is true, I would expect the teachings believers are accountable for to be preserved with exceptional clarity. Instead, I see sincere scholars disagreeing not merely about interpretation, but sometimes about whether a report should function as evidence at all. That is the philosophical issue that now interests me. Ironically, this discussion made me appreciate Gandhi's questions more than many of his answers. I remain unconvinced by several of his conclusions because I often think he gives modern ethical intuitions greater weight than many classical readings would support. But acknowledging that does not erase the value of the methodological questions he raises. In fact, those questions become even more important, regardless of whether one ultimately follows Gandhi, Malik, Shafi'i, or another scholar. 3 facts stood out to me. First, Hadith scholarship itself acknowledges that not every circulating report was accepted. Second, major Sunni scholars developed different methodologies for weighing evidence. Third, recovering Muhammad's teachings requires substantial historical reasoning, rather than merely opening a book and reading clear instructions. The biggest thing I learned from this discussion is not that hadith are false. It is that the process of recovering Muhammad's teachings is much more dependent on human historical judgment than I had previously appreciated. My takeaway is simple. The deeper question is no longer, quote, is this hadith authentic? The deeper question is, If Allah intended Muhammad's guidance to remain the final authority for humanity, should discovering that guidance require so many layers of historical reconstruction and scholarly disagreement? Whether you're a believer, a skeptic, or simply someone interested in Islamic history, I think that question deserves serious reflection.